You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we've been talking about these court cases that Trump's been contending with for quite a while now. Finally, another one has just made its way up to the Supreme Court. We have a pretty surprising ruling here. Can you explain what just happened?
Yeah, Brian, this I view as the first test of whether the Supreme Court will let Donald Trump's sort of appetite for dictatorship, his abuse of power, go completely unchecked. And at least today, 5 Supreme Court justices said, no, we're going to be a legitimate check on Donald Trump's sort of, desire for unconstrained power. And here's what they did. A lower court judge, a judge named Amir Ali, had ruled that Donald Trump's freezing of all money, all congressionally appropriated funds that were going to U.S. aid organizations, Judge Ali ordered, you have to unfreeze it and you have to make good on your financial obligations. You have to pay the U.S. aid contractors the money that essentially they are owed, that Congress appropriated for this purpose. So, of course, once Judge Ali told the Trump administration, no, you can't do what you want to do, Donald Trump beat feet up to the Supreme Court. And Brian, today, 5 of the justices, including crossover justices, Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, side with the liberal wing of the Supreme Court. They said Judge Ali's order stands, and they directed Judge Ali to have some further hearings to decide, okay, which financial obligations is it feasible to make the Trump administration start paying. But the point is, when the Supreme Court had the opportunity to say, we're either going to lay down and let Donald Trump do whatever he wants to expand the power of the chief executive, or we're going to stand up and be a legitimate co-equal branch of government and serve as the check and balance against not only Donald Trump's abuse and overreach, but Donald Trump running roughshod over the legislative branch, because this is money the legislative branch had appropriated for this purpose. I am really pleased to report that the Supreme Court stood up, stood strong. They're holding at the moment, and they told Donald Trump no. Now, this is a preliminary ruling, and obviously this is one battle in what will likely be a long line of battles over, Donald Trump's abuse of power. But today, it was a win for democracy. It was a win for the American people. It was a win for 3 legitimate co-equal branches of government that are there to check one another. And frankly, it is a win for the U.S. aid workers and organizations who are literally doing America's work around the globe.
Welcome to the Resistance, Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts. Glenn, is it true now that we have this ruling from the Supreme Court that we've spoken about the prospect of a constitutional crisis quite a bit? This is really the groundwork that if the Trump administration decides to ignore the will of the Supreme Court, that would put us in constitutional crisis territory for the first time.
Yeah, Brian, you're a real buzzkill, because I thought we were on a high, but you know what? You're going to the exact next place now that the Trump administration will be in a position, to have been told no and be ordered to do something they don't want to do. The big ticket question is, will they comply? And if they choose not to comply, that will plunge us into a true constitutional crisis. And then we will have to talk about, okay, how do we extract ourselves from that true constitutional crisis? That's probably a conversation for another day.
Well, there are going to be folks watching this and listening to me say that and say, what are you talking about? We've been in a constitutional crisis this whole time. So what would you say to those people?
Yeah, I would say every minute that Donald Trump has been in power, and that's during his first term and the current term, it feels like our Constitution is in crisis in a very real sense. But really the most accurate definition of a constitutional crisis is when 2 branches of government have now butted heads, and one branch will not acknowledge the lawful authority of the other branch. So if the Supreme Court says, hey, Trump administration, you can't do that, it's unlawful, it's unconstitutional, and the Trump administration says, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway, that is the definition of a true constitutional crisis, because there is no referee, there's no tiebreaker. There's no higher authority that can force one branch of government to acknowledge the lawful authority and really the superior status in some respects of another branch of government. Because, Brian, ever since Marbury versus Madison, it is the Supreme Court that has the final say regarding what is and is not constitutional. So that is why I say, for the first time, although it feels like we've been in crisis for a very long time, this may now ripen into a true constitutional crisis.
Well, to that exact point, while we're talking about this prospect of a constitutional crisis being when you have one branch of government that ignores the express will of another branch of government, could you make the argument that when Elon Musk and Doge decided to prevent the allocation of properly congressionally allocated funding, that landed us there unto itself?
So that is a crisis, and it's governmental abuse, overreach, and I would argue corruption and perhaps criminality. But it's not a true constitutional crisis because there are lawsuits being filed against, Elon Musk and his little band of, fraternity boys going around and doing Lord knows what in our personal protected privacy information.
So part of this is that by virtue of going into the courts to adjudicate this stuff, that is the government also working as it should.
Exactly. And until it sort of reaches that point where, we have exhausted all remedies in both branches of government, and now one is not acknowledging the lawful authority of another, that's when we are in constitutional crisis territory.
Glenn, I know you thought that I was a buzzkill before, but I'm going to be even more of a buzzkill now and ask whether you think that because this issue isn't really something that one would think that Republicans really hold dear, that this is kind of a bone that the Supreme Court through the pro-democracy faction, through the left, to say, look, I know that you're saying that we're an illegitimate court, but look, we can rule against this White House too, knowing full well that when it comes to USAID, that's not one of those issues that's not a huge hill to die on. That's an issue that they can kind of throw some crumbs to the left and say, okay, we'll free up a couple $billion in USAID, but when it comes to the real stuff, the presidential immunity stuff, the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment stuff, that we've all got our guy.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point to make. My counterpoint would be, this does not really strike me as a bone-throwing Supreme Court to placate anybody. So when they have wanted to rule in Donald Trump's favor, even when they had to find a workaround, ignore, or contradict the express language of the Constitution, they felt completely comfortable doing it. So I don't see this as throwing a bone. I see this as at least the 5 justices who ruled against Donald Trump and his administration and his position taking a stand and saying, listen, we have decided we're going to actually honor the Constitution and uphold our responsibility to be a co-equal, separate branch of government that serves as a check against abuses, overreach, and illegality by the other 2 branches of government. And, here are a couple of other observations that I think are important, but perhaps not intuitive. One, I view it as really important that the Supreme Court just supported what Judge Ali did. It is no easy thing for a federal court judge to say, listen, I am ruling against the entire executive branch of the federal government, and I am directing them to pay the billions of dollars that they really ought to pay because they have these contractual and financial obligations to pay these U.S. aid organizations. It's no easy thing for a federal court judge to do. And there's a really important atmospheric value to what the Supreme Court just did. They said to Judge Ali, listen, if you believe it's the right thing and it is supported by the law and the Constitution, do it, and we, at least in this instance, will have your back. That is so important because, one, there are issues like this, preliminary injunctions, temporary restraining orders, suits that are being brought against the Trump administration, abuse and overreach in courts all across the country, federal courts in probably every federal jurisdiction at this point. And it's really important for those federal judges to know when they make these difficult decisions that there is a good chance that the Supreme Court will have their back. Because, Brian, I know a lot of judges. I litigated before a lot of judges, military, civilian, federal, state, trial court, and appellate court. None of them want to be reversed by an appellate court, particularly not by a Supreme Court. And that always weighs on their mind. Yes, they make their decisions based on the facts and the law presented to them, but none of them want to be reversed. This, I think, sends an important message to the field, the trial court bench around the country, that if you do the right thing, the Supreme Court will have your back. Maybe not always, but in this instance, will have your back. Here's the second thing that I think is rich. Justice Alito complained vociferously about who does Judge Ali think he is, just directing the entire executive branch of the federal government to pay out, billions of dollars to these U.S. aid organizations.
He's like, who is he to judge him?
Yeah. So, of course, I would ask the question, who is Donald Trump to refuse to abide by the legal obligations of the executive branch? I can only assume Judge Alito is on his way out to the flagpole and will be flying his flag upside down because of this outrage. And you know what, Justice Alito, just unbunch your panties, because there are a lot of fights like this to come.
Finally, let's finish off with this. What are next steps in this case as we await compliance, really?
Yeah, so the next step is this is now going back to Judge Ali for some further hearings. This case is far from over. This is the first skirmish in what will be a very long war on this particular issue. And the Supreme Court, among other things, said, okay, so now that we have upheld your order that the Trump administration must unfreeze and pay out, make good on its financial obligations, we want you to engage in some fact-finding about which financial obligations need to be paid and what is the feasibility of getting them paid promptly. So we want you to put some more factual meat on the bones, and then, this will inevitably be appealed up to the Supreme Court, perhaps multiple times before this litigation is completely over and done, which could take months.
Well, look, my endless pit of cynicism aside, glad for the good news today, and we will, of course, stay on top of this case as it continues to play itself out. For those who are watching right now, if you'd like to support the work that Glenn and I do, if you'd like to support independent media more broadly, especially at this moment where we are watching legacy media heap more undue attention, more undue influence, and undue favor onto this Trump administration, please make sure to subscribe to our channels. The links are right here on the screen. And Glenn is fast making his way to 1 million subscribers. So again, if you've not yet subscribed to his channel, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.